Reconstruction. Reconstruction is a period that followed the U.S. Civil War. Southern states had to be readmitted into the Union. The war-torn economies had to be rebuilt, and the emancipated freemen and women had to be incorporated. Let's take a look at the essential question. Which people or groups played the most significant roles during Reconstruction? Abraham Lincoln was the 16th President of the United States, and the president that led the country through the Civil War. Unfortunately, he couldn't implement his plans for Reconstruction, as he was assassinated in 1865, just a week after General Lee surrendered. Influence on Reconstruction. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all the slaves in the Confederacy in 1865. During his second inaugural address, promised a very lenient plan for Reconstruction. His 10% plan allowed Southern states to be readmitted once 10% of their voters had pledged allegiance to the Union and accepted the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's review the key contributions and facts for Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves in the Confederacy. Promised a lenient plan for readmitting seceded states. His 10% plan allowed Southern states to form governments once 10% of voters had pledged allegiance to the Union. Lincoln was shot and died before he could implement his Reconstruction plan. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was the 17th President of the United States. Johnson was Lincoln's vice president and became president after his assassination. He was a former slave owner from Tennessee. Influence on Reconstruction. Johnson granted pardons to Confederate leaders. Johnson did not believe in equality for African Americans and did not want real change in the South. President Johnson rushed to recognize state governments formed by former Confederates. These governments, in turn, passed black codes, suppressing the rights of African Americans. Let's review the key contributions and facts for Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson had been Lincoln's vice president for only a month when he became president after Lincoln's death. Johnson pardoned many Confederate leaders and recognized the governments they formed in the South. These governments passed black codes, which restricted freemen's rights and kept them tied to the plantations. Congress impeached Andrew Johnson, but did not remove him from office. Radical Republicans. Radical Republicans were a group of Republicans who strongly believed that the former Confederates should be punished and that African Americans should be granted full rights. Influence on Reconstruction. They passed a civil rights bill and a bill to enlarge the Freemans Bureau. They passed the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. They passed a Reconstruction bill with a plan to reverse Johnson's lenient admissions of states, militarize the South, and give freemen more rights. They impeached President Johnson, but failed to remove him from office by just one vote. Let's review the key contributions and facts for Radical Republicans. Radical Republicans passed a Civil Rights Act to give African Americans civil and political rights. They passed the Reconstruction Amendments 13, 14, and 15 to consolidate the rights of African Americans. They moved to impeach President Johnson, failing to remove him from office by just one vote. The Freedmen. The Freedmen were the 4 million men and women, former slaves, emancipated by the 13th Amendment. Influence on Reconstruction. They presented the challenge of how to enter into public life and the market economy. They gained political and civil rights, especially the right to vote. Southern state legislatures passed black codes limiting their newly gained rights and freedoms. They were subject to discrimination, violence, and segregation under the Jim Crow laws. Let's review the key contributions and facts for freedmen. Freedmen gained civil and political rights, especially the right to vote. As African Americans voted for the first time, blacks were also elected for office. Hiram Rhodes Revels became the first African American to sit on Congress when he was elected as senator from Mississippi in 1870. The rise in African American political representation would only be temporary, and soon the rights that they had earned would be taken away. Jim Crow laws and segregation became the norm in the South, and blacks were forced to use separate and often inferior facilities. The Freemans Bureau. The Freemans Bureau was a government agency established by Congress in March 1865 to help former slaves face the challenges of their new lives as freed men and women. Influence on Reconstruction. It helped freed men and women search for loved ones separated by slavery and war. It provided education to African Americans, especially to help them read and write. It helped African Americans to become self-sufficient, rebuild farms, and find work. Let's review the key contributions and facts for the Freedmen Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau helped African Americans with the many challenges they face, like finding their family members separated during slavery, learning to read and write, and receiving education. They even offered loans and helped a limited number of African Americans to set up or rebuild farms. The Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, started as a secret society and white supremacist group that primarily targeted and terrorized African Americans to suppress their rights and freedoms. Other groups who used anti-black violence include the White League and the Knights of the White Camellia. Influence on Reconstruction. These groups openly threatened African Americans who tried to vote, teachers, and community leaders. Lynchings or public hangings by mobs became common. Laws were systematically enforced against blacks, and white perpetrators often walked free. Let's review the key facts for the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was a secret society that believed in white supremacy and resented the rights and gains of African Americans. The KKK terrorized black leaders and their families and suppressed voters by riding in the middle of the night, burning crosses, and carrying out lynchings or public hangings without facing legal consequences. Carpetbaggers and Scalawags. Carpetbaggers was the name given to Northerners who came to the South to help freedmen. Scalawags were Southern whites who supported Reconstruction, often to get government contracts. Influence on Reconstruction. Some of these contractors had the conviction of helping freedmen, while some were just in it to obtain government contracts for economic gain. There was a lot of corruption in the process, and many African Americans did not receive the services that the government had paid for. Let's review the key facts for Carpetbaggers and Scalawags. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who came to the South to help with Reconstruction. They received that name because they often came with a bag made out of carpet material, much like the one in the picture. Scalawags, on the other hand, were Southerners who supported Reconstruction. Both Carpetbaggers and Scalawags were seen as either intruders or traitors, and often engaged in corruption, failing to offer African Americans the services that the government had paid for.